Hello, hello, and welcome to our Sunday stream of the month. That should be theme of the month, Sunday stream. I am slightly sleepy, and clearly it's going to be one of those streams, so buckle up, guys. I'm very, very excited to be here, though. I am here with our guest, Angela McCain, who I will be introducing in just a moment. Our topic of the month, that's for the whole of March 2019, is myths and legends for world building. How we're going to use them, how can you use them in world building, how can you leverage them in your plots, whatever you might be writing for. So if you missed last month's streams, which were about world building scaffolding and avoiding sneaky world building plot holes, you can find all of those on our YouTube channel. That is youtube.com/World Anvil. And Dimitri's going to drop the link in the chat right now for the playlist specifically for those streams. And this stream will be up on YouTube probably next week or the week after. So if you miss it, or if you have to check out to go and do something else, you can catch the whole stream along with all the details at the bottom on our YouTube channel. So make sure you tune in there. If you have a question to ask, we will be answering all of our questions at the end of the stream. So make sure you write capital letters question and then your question. Otherwise, our producer will not catch it and it will never get answered. Oh, noes! We want to avoid that, obviously. So remember, capital letters question before your question. Also, if you guys would like to weigh in with your own favorite myths and legends, we would be absolutely thrilled to hear about those and chat about those at the end of the stream as well. So keep those coming into the chat section. I think it's finally time to introduce Angela before she goes off and leaves me.
Oh, no, I'd be quietly in the corner this whole time.
You're very, very patient. Thank you, Angela. So, Angela McCain, you may recognize her from Nerdsmith. She is a Jill of all trades, a writer, a tabletop RPG player, a DM, a producer, a singer, and probably everything else as well. We are absolutely thrilled to have her. She has credits as a published author, a live streaming role player, as I said, with Nerdsmith, as a voice actor, and a singer-songwriter as well. She was the producer, casting director, and about 1,000 other jobs for the Vox Machina and Exandrian musical that was created for Critical Role. It was an awesome fan-made venture, which was a mashup between like Hamilton and then also the plot of Critical Role. And then it was incredible, and the art was amazing, and the singing was fantastic. And if you haven't checked that out, you should check it out. You can find it on YouTube. She is also one of the founding members of the very wonderful Nerdsmith, which is a network of creatives and creators celebrating nerdiness and talent and passion and all good things and pro-LGBT and all the good stuff. And that began in March 2018, so it's still pretty new, huh?
It's our 1 year this week. We went live on March 1st. We're super duper excited.
Happy birthday! That's
Thank you.
Awesome.
And we counted all of our content hours, and we just broke 1,000 this week too. So we have 1,000 hours of content on the network if you ever want to check out all the stuff that we're doing.
Holy crap, that is amazing. Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
And you guys are going to be at WonderCon, aren't you, at the end of the month?
We are. We are doing a meetup at WonderCon. But I think you know that, Janet.
I do, because we are sponsoring you. Oh, yeah. So you guys know that we are massive Nerdsmith fans. If we are the Anvil, they are the Smiths. We are super psyched about them. So we are sponsoring that meetup. But if you enjoy what Angela is saying, if you enjoy her presence and her persona, I know I do, then absolutely go check out WonderCon. That's going to be in the LA area. At the end of March, and we'll be talking a bit more about that later as well. So, but if you don't stay to the end, and I hope you do, make sure you check out WonderCon. All right, I think we should kick straight off now with myths and legends. So what do we mean by myths and legends?
Well, I would imagine that there's a couple of different directions you can go with that. You can, I mean, I personally, since I was a little kid, absolutely obsessed with, I guess what you would call classical mythologies, but I think that just means like the ones that Western culture really focuses on. So Greek, Roman, and Egyptian were the big ones that I was really into. To this day, at my parents' house, my old bedroom covered in a hieroglyphic wallpaper. So it's just the best. I love that they kept it up. But yeah, that is now my niece's room.
That's awesome.
But yeah, so I would imagine that defining mythology would be anything from the way that cultures try to explain natural phenomena or interpersonal phenomena. And that can be anything from sort of larger than life heroes to straight up deities and pantheons of just supernatural occurrences. A lot of it's like supernatural explanations for natural phenomena in the world. And that can come from any number of corners of culture or geography.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did a little bit of digging and a little bit of prep for this. And the generally accepted terminology is that myths are traditional stories that often include supernatural elements and therefore are probably not true.
Okay.
Which is how they're perceived now. Now, myths that we think are myths may have been perceived, however, as legends, that is to say, unauthenticated history. So, for example, the story of King Arthur, the idea is that there is a grain of truth in there, even though he probably didn't have a magical sword, that probably wasn't a dragon. You know, like a lot of the more supernatural elements, looking at Merlin with a bit of side eye, these things were probably not real, but there is believed to be a grain of truth in this. So the kind of things we're talking about are like creation myths. What you were talking about was etiological stories. So that's like how the Rudyard Kipling was great with these, how the elephant got his nose, how the whale got his throat, how the Giant's Causeway was made, what rainbows are, which is of course the Noah's Ark story, or the ancient Greeks had a story about the god Iris, who was the goddess of colors, and there's a story about that from her. So yeah, these are called etiological stories, and they're kind of like how X, like why X is like that, why Y is like that. And then of course you get these stories of like personalities, like heroes, like kind of like Robin Hood, Gilgamesh, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite of those?
Oh, of the heroic ones?
Yeah.
I always enjoyed, honestly, I always enjoyed the Pantheon myths. So I think if anyone has my email address, Artemis is always one of my favorites in terms of figures and personalities.
Yeah, she's pretty badass.
Yeah, that's a big one for me.
Yeah, for me it was Perseus. I always liked Perseus because he was smart. Hercules was like, I want to hump it or hit it. Perseus was like, I shall use my brain to get out of this problem. But yeah, you see a lot of oral traditions feeding into this as well, like the Odyssey and the Iliad. The Odyssey for sure, which was written down by Homer, was probably an epic long before Homer actually wrote the damn thing down.
Sure. Yeah.
So you see a lot of these kinds of things that are also feeding into myths and legends as well.
And Homer's rendition would easily be just what's considered definitive because it was written down. There's how many that it probably went through how many permutations before it even got to him.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very much like the Grimm fairy tales, if you will. Like there were many permutations. There were fairy tales and traditional tales in the zeitgeist, and then Grimm wrote down the definitive versions.
And even those have been so
sabotaged.
Mutated since then.
Exactly. And that's one of the beautiful things about myths and legends, is that you see so many different versions in different cultures, which is one of the reasons, skipping ahead, that I think they make world building so culturally rich.
Absolutely.
You can have different versions in different cultures, and the way the cultures decide what is important, the way the cultures redraft them to feed their own cultural ideologies, is what shows doesn't tell how the culture works, what is important for this culture or whatever. So yeah, I mean, that's absolutely something. So here's the big question: how do you use myths and legends in world building?
How do you use existing myths and legends, or how do you make your own?
Well, either.
We can talk about either. I would say,
why don't we start with pre-existing myths and legends, because that's a good place to jump off of.
Sure. So from my own writing experience, I legitimately just cribbed an entire pantheon for the first thing I ever attempted writing. I had written what I think at this point would have basically account to a YA novel that was riffing off of Greek mythology and the Greek pantheon, and what I was interested in was the interpersonal dynamics between those figures and placing them in a more modern setting and just sort of exploring what those archetypes would be in a more modern context. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is, depending on the I guess depending on the time period your world technically would take place in, recontextualizing myths that you find engaging, I think would be a very interesting way to approach it. Reflavoring a myth to to see what it says about current culture, or how the stories that people often get out of those myths, what can you get out of that in a current setting, or in your setting of your story.
Yeah.
um
No,
and that
absolutely.
and that could be anywhere from, like I said, if myths are prehistory, there's not really a copyright on them. So you could just take that myth, change up names and settings and the flavor of that story, and tell a similar story. Or you might find yourself going down different paths with what the outcome of that myth was. You might decide, "Oh, well, let's explore a different outcome for that story." So any of the sort of tragic heroes are trying to teach a moral lesson through, or you have like Narcissus or something, you could explore something different with those basic puzzle pieces of those myths, so you could adapt them.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely. Um,
um
I
Go
think
ahead.
there's also something to be said for using them not verbatim, but using the flavor of them as a quick hook for your audience to understand where you're coming from with regard to something. So
Yeah.
if you know that you want something to be quite Egyptian, you just hook in the Pantheon. You hook in the some of the stories. Perhaps you have a Book of the Dead. Who knows? I mean, again, that's a big part of the Egyptian history, but also the Egyptian mythos is this relationship with the afterlife.
Hmm.
Um, and if that's something you wanted to explore, but or at least it's something you want to present to your audience, there's no shame in just bringing something in, just importing the concept so that the audience, whoever the audience is, understands that quickly, because then it reduces the learning curve on that aspect.
Sure, using the cultural touchstones that we have on
Absolutely.
different myths in order to give you that sort of quick reference point. You have a god that just philanders around and is just the big boss kind of character. You immediately have a clue in on Zeus. Like, that's sort of, oh, that's the archetype they're playing with. Archetypes are so, well, they come from most myths, but playing with that archetype to give people that clue. Yeah, no, definitely.
Right, exactly. And again, the thing that you see from myths and legends that is sort of in the tool belt of every author in the world is the hero's journey. So
Absolutely, yeah.
reskinning a hero's journey, as you were talking about, sort of reskinning and importing these and updating them. Reskinning a hero's journey is another way that you can use pre-existing myth or legend material to tell your own story.
Hmm. Oh, absolutely. Let me think, what else would be a good way to approach it. um I'm drawing a blank right now, but I keep
Yeah,
thinking.
no, no worries. Um, the other thing, and this is something that I use for one of my books, is I just read a book set in 1768, um, in which the premise is that magic is real but secret and operates
Okay.
pretty much like the myths and legends, but
Hmm.
it's from the time of 1768, right? So the people in there are characters from the 18th century. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that you can do with reception history. So that is how the 18th century viewed the classical world as opposed to how we viewed the classical world.
Okay.
So looking at history through the lens of history.
Hmm.
Um, and again, it tells you so much how people interpret these things as to who they are and what they find important.
Oh yeah, the lessons that they draw from them, the hierarchy of importance they put on things.
Absolutely.
You could certainly have a more an older culture or an older historical context valuing something in those stories that suddenly gets vilified or is just completely dismissed in more in later civilizations or later cultural movements.
Right,
Uh,
exactly. And for example, imagine something set in the near future where the gender revolution, which we're going through now, which I mean, we are undeniably going through a social revolution now.
mhm.
Imagine that reaches a conclusion wherein everybody is androgynous, and then you look back at the ancient Greek legends through the lens of that, like because they're so gender divided and they're
Sure.
so gender stereotyped. Looking at them through that lens, all of a sudden it gives you this like fascinating perspective. And from a world building perspective, the views of the characters in which, you know, gender doesn't mean so much anymore. Like they've got past a point where gender is terribly important in this fictional world that I just made up. And then they look at these places from the past and these stories from the past, and their reactions are going to tell you so much about the present day attitudes.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah. How concrete and segregated the gender experience was in those different cultures. Oh yeah, that would be really neat.
I mean, that's just a single example, literally off the top of my head right now. But like, that's one way of using myths, pre-existing myths and legends, as a mechanic to drive the story forward, to give you perspective and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, you could even you could couch a hero's myth in the way to describe or compare two different cultures in your story. You can have a myth that has perhaps and this is a little bit more black and white, but you have a myth that has a clear delineated hero and a clearly delineated villain, and two different characters in your story are from cultures that deify different people in that story, and figuring out what that says about their cultural values, what that says about their definition of heroism or their definition of altruism even. You can really explore characters based on their value systems, looking at the same exact example of a story.
Right. And to take that one step further, there's a great example from a Terry Pratchett book called Thud, in which there's a single historical event in which the trolls swear the dwarves attacked first and the dwarves swear the trolls attacked first, but it is the same battle, and the stories around this battle have completely defined the cultural ideologies of how these two cultures refer to each other. It's like one of those sort of crux points, and they both blame the other one, and nobody knows the real history anymore.
Yeah. I had something, but no, that's an absolutely great example that you have sort of you wish you had a Rashomon moment where you could see the backstory of both those from the perspective of both those groups, but everyone just agrees that something bad happened, but nobody can agree on the cause. Causal relationships in mythology is having that little blank space, and that blank space is where the contention comes from.
Yeah,
I like that a lot.
So how do you use myths in world building?
Well, a really, really good and in my head fresh example, in our D&D stream, Countless Heroes, so we decided to build a world from scratch, and part of it came, and the core conceit of that world came from an origin story. A mythological origin story was the little seed that we grew the world from. And Logan, our DM, proposed the world concept from this origin myth of the dragon mother, that there was a great celestial dragon that had laid an egg, and the egg was the world that we knew of. And whether or not that's a real interpretation of what happened, like a factual interpretation, or if that's just the mythos that people have built around how the world came to be, we took sort of threads from any of those angles and built out the world from that. It was, we talked about the ramifications of that being the mythology. What kind of cultures crop up from that? So you're going to have dragon cults. You're going to have people that are obsessed with dragons. What does that mean? And we're in a D&D 5e setting. So what does that mean for the dragonborn or any of the lizard races of people that you have a figurehead in your pantheon that is a female dragon? What does that mean for how they see themselves in the world? Are they venerated? Are they saw as like less than because they're not full dragons? Like what is that interaction? So we knew that would have some interesting cultural implications for the people that physically looked like the embodiment of the high deity in the mythology. So we started at that seed of that small conceit of what a larger believed origin story was for the world, and then kind of teased out little aspects of different types of cultures that could arise from that. And we had originally come up with, well, part of the origin of this is we had intended to play an Eberron. That was originally the world we were going to set in. So I had a Warforged I wanted to play. And I'm like, oh yeah, I want to play a construct. That would be really cool. And we decided we wanted to have in the world of Vale, we wanted to have our own construct race. We wanted to do something new, something that didn't just feel like Warforged repainted. And when we were talking about what became the Goa in Countless Heroes, our statue construct race, we were talking about the mother dragon and the egg, and how some people might revere the world as this sacred egg. And we were talking about what these statues were going to be made of, and I was coming up with this idea of like alabaster golems as this thing. And I went, okay, alabaster looks a heck of a lot like eggshell. What if the substance that these Goa are made of is a deep material in the world that is the eggshell of the world? And so it's this sacred material, this sacred substance, because it looks like it is literally the shell of the great dragon mother's egg. So we found this little connector, and all of a sudden the Goa became a really intricate part of the world building, for at least mythologically, that they're made of this arcane substance that is kind of our for some reason the word wonderflonium came into my head, but it's like our unobtainium. It's our mystical arcane substance that can do a lot of different things depending on what it needs to do in the story. So this idea that Logan had completely separate from that come up with this dragon mother metaphor, and we had already been planning a different race that ended up working so beautifully together. It created a lot of as someone who plays a Goa in the show, created a lot of investment in the history of the world that I wouldn't necessarily have had if I hadn't played something that was so integral to the mythos of the origin story.
Right.
But yeah, it created a ton of, it was just this lattice work of where the myth could go or what that could mean for the world. We started from the beginning, and then we branched out from there, saying, okay, well, what does that mean for this culture? Okay, if that means that for this culture, what else does that mean? What's the next phase of this cultural development if they start from this origin belief? So having an origin story that feels like a real fun hook can do a lot for how your cultures see themselves. Because we have a lot of cultures in our world that are sort of, you say, like sun based. The fact that our sun is such a pivotal element in our a natural world, you're going to have a lot of religions, a lot of different cultures that revolve a lot of their practices and a lot of their belief structures around the existence of the sun and how prominent it is. So something else could easily, like if, say, the moon is a more prominent thing in your world, you have sort of a way longer night cycle, that can do a ton for what culturally and what even naturally could happen in your world. And the lore is going to reflect that. Those primary things, those very primary things that show up in the world can really influence where cultures then develop.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've touched on something really important there, which is that using these kinds of ideas, using this kind of lore, it really makes a world that is so deep and integrated, and then it feels a lot more authentic.
Mm-hmm.
So if nothing else, using myths and legends in your world building and making sure that you integrate them with belief and with something relevant is really going to make your world feel like a more realistic place, even if you've got dragons flying overhead and soup that attacks you or whatever you have, whatever your hook is.
Sure.
So yeah, no, absolutely.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and we already talked a lot about cultural development and sort of how myths and legends can, for example, typify a cultural attitude or a moral, which can be very revealing. And again, one of the things that we've been discussing is like making sure that your cultures are different, and myths and legends are really good for that.
Oh yeah,
Do you have different origin myths for your world in different cultures, or is it all the same in the
we discussed this idea. There are potentially some different flavors. I think we talked about the idea that the Dragon Mother was a very popular, if not like the dominant origin story, but we have different places that have maybe a lot less of an emphasis on it. And a lot of people, it's how you read it. We talked initially about there are like 3 different readings. We've written like sort of holy texts for what
Nice.
these origin myths are. And there's a few different flavors. There's one that talks about the great dragon mother being, the protector of all, and sort of your everyone is in her clutch. Like that's sort of the tone of it. But then there's also the interpretation that the egg was perfect and everything on top of it, aka the world, is imperfect and just a shadow of the perfection of what's underneath. And when people start devolving too far from the dragon mother's perception of what perfection is, she is going to raise the shell of her egg with fire and wipe everything out to start over. So there's an apocalyptic element that some people believe is part of it, that you're either a part of the egg is just the life cycle, and the natural world is one big ecosystem, or we're parasites on top of the egg. There are very different ways of interpreting the idea that we are very, very small and there is something much, much bigger above us that could
Yeah.
ruin everything if we don't, like, it can be moralistic. We have people that are like, if you don't stay in line, if we don't abide by what we've interpreted to be the morality of this world, Dragon Mother's gonna burn you. Uh, there's the people that are just like, it's so much bigger than us, and you have to enjoy life and live it to the fullest because you never know when that apocalypse is gonna happen. And then there's some people that very much revere her because they believe she would protect things, and keep you safe because you're part of the egg. So we've interpreted it in multiple different directions. And so if we wanted to create a culture that felt um, very different in the way it approaches life and approaches, say, strangers that come to their world, we can pick from a different perspective, and then you create a very nihilistic tone or a very optimistic altruism in the culture, depending on maybe how they perceive that origin. But even beyond that, we went past that original origin, and we're almost in the 2nd generation of the mythology in our world, because we loved complicating things, if nothing else. Um, the mother dragon in the mythology, there are primal deities that represent all the different elements or all the different domains you would find in, say, a 5e campaign. Uh, and we decided it would be fun to create deities that represented more than one domain. So you had this interesting crosswork. You had a god, it's sort of already built into 5e, but the idea that those primal gods, the god of arcane, the god of life and death and nature, those aren't worshipped really anymore. And we wanted to create a polytheistic worldview. D&D tends to be very monotheistic. There's a lot of gods, but people tend to only worship one.
Right. Sure.
And it reminded me quite a bit of how, say, just for lack of example, the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians would have a god for different circumstances.
Sure. Different aspects of the.
Yeah, the domains are not just you focus solely on that domain. There are gods that are represented and worshipped depending on the aspect of your life you need help with or you need guidance on. So with our pantheon structure, there's a domain of, like, I want to say 8, maybe 7 of gods that all represent one domain, but they each also have a subdomain. So they represent the idea that it's a holistic view of life, but they have sort of their own little specialty within that bigger view of life. So we had a lot of fun with the idea of, it feels complicated. Like I said, there's a lot of a lattice work going on, but the idea was to make it feel like every belief structure you could be a part of had a holistic opinion on how to live your life. It wasn't just, we're the nature gods, I don't give a crap about life or death or whatever, I just want to deal with plants and that's it. And it's just a very unrealistic way of thinking people would look at life. There's so much going on, you'd have to account for other elements of existence, especially in a magical world. So we decided we wanted to make sure that no matter what your worldview or no matter what your religion or belief structure was, you had some nuance there to allow for a complete experience of the day-to-day life of a person.
That's really interesting. Wow.
I'm really proud of that, the Pantheon stuff that we've been working on.
Nice. Yeah, it sounds fascinating. All right, guys, we are going to cut for a very short break now. So join us in 3 or 4 minutes. You can go and grab some water. I'm going to go do the same thing. And we are going to be talking about how to use myths and legends when you're creating TTRPG campaigns, when you're creating narrative prose, and the different ways that you can leverage myths and legends to make your world building and your stories more interesting. So join us in 3 or 4 minutes for that. See you soon. Welcome back, everybody. We got water, so we can talk more. Aren't you guys lucky?
Hydration, super important.
Oh yeah. When we left you, we were talking about how to use mythologies and legends when you were doing world building. Now, in this section, we're going to focus more on using them, for example, for campaigns and for narrative prose, more on a plot level than on a world building level, and how you can use them to drive the story, to add background, to use them for exposition even. So, Angela, why don't you kick us off by telling us about your book? I know you've
it's like a script Bible at this point.
Sure.
But that does mean I have things. So I'm slowly working on a book that it didn't occur to me till you invited me to come on board the show, how integral mythology is to the way that the world works in my book. But my story revolves around the idea of the world used to be inhabited by giants, much bigger people, and it takes place centuries, if not millennia, after these giants are no longer around, and everybody exists in these spaces, whether it's buildings or just regions that are not built for them. They are just smaller than everything.
Sure.
So you have, ancient temples that have scaffolding built into them, so now they're 3-story buildings instead of a single room, things like that. And I built this idea around the kinds of people that would develop in a world where they're clearly not, like, this world doesn't feel like it's meant for you. You are squatting in a very old place that was never intended for you.
Right.
And it builds on this idea that perhaps the giant elements of things has to do with the inherent magic, like, infused in people. So the idea that people are just less magical than they were before. So it's in a place that feels rather mundane, except for there were giants here once. And there are, I build a bunch of MacGuffins into my story.
Everybody loves MacGuffins. By the way, guys, if you don't know what a MacGuffin is, because it's sort of a technical literary term, so I'm just going to jump in here. A MacGuffin is a sort of an item that is inherently part of a plot, is something valuable that people want, even though often it has no workable value itself. Sometimes it's an item that does a thing, and sometimes it's an item that does not do a thing, but it is inherently valuable and it drives the story forward. An example of MacGuffin would be the One Ring in Lord of the Rings. Classic MacGuffin. Everybody wants it. People are willing to kill for it. It drives the plot forward. The whole thing is about the ring. That's why it's called the Lord of the Rings. But nobody uses the ring that much. If you notice, it's a thing that makes things happen because
it's a symbol rather than in and of itself a tool that is being utilized. Like, you have it and you get power. It's a very abstract concept.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you replaced it with a magic muffin, it would be exactly the same. So that's what a MacGuffin is. I'm sorry, do carry on.
Be slightly stale by the end of that book, though.
Crunchy. Tell you what, if they throw it at the spider,
there you go.
That's how I would have done that. Anyway, let's stop talking about battle muffins and keep talking about your book.
So the premise, I have the world tentatively titled the Land of Fallen Giants. There's like, and you go online, you look up giants, you'll find tons of cool stuff. My Pinterest board is full of giant skeletons embedded into the sides of mountains and things like monuments built out of a sword that's sticking in the ground that's like 50 feet tall. That sort of scale we're talking about. But so I decided that the reason the giants aren't there anymore has to do with an effort to ascend to godhood. They amassed power and magic and and the energy they could pull from their own people to become gods. And so you have these objects of power that are interspersed around the world, and I use myths, what people believe, and I still haven't really decided how many of them are real, to explain how people see certain, like I said, geographic things in their world. There's a giant crevice in the bay of this seaside town that they think, well, one of those mystical objects sank to the bottom of the world, and so it just doesn't look like there's a bottom to this giant trench in the middle of this bay. And these objects might have some magical significance. They might eventually become something that gives you power, but there are ways to explain. That's like how we were talking before, like explaining how a river or a bridge or a mountain came to be.
Right, they're etiological MacGuffins.
Right, and my one of my characters is a bard, and I introduce her in her first chapter, telling the myth of that story.
Nice.
But by doing the, and we did a couple of, I did a couple of things that we talked about. She is expressing this story through an instrumental she's playing, and she's thinking about what each of the melodies she's using or what she's doing musically to interpret what's going on in the story. And she takes something very different than other people typically take from this story. It's a tragic, heroic love story. It ends in like I said, star-crossed. It ends in tragedy, and she takes the tragedy less as the lovers being unable to be together, and more of one of them going off and having to sacrifice her ship, something she loves so much and so dearly, and she connects way more with the idea of losing that ship and having to sacrifice it to survive. And I like the idea that I'm able to do a couple of things with that. I'm able to actually tell that story, so I can plant the seed of the idea of a mystical object that apparently might be at the bottom of this water. I'm able to build in a little bit of the idea, some of the terminology for these giant races that existed. So there's like great orcs and great elves, and they were just bigger in scale. So I'm able to use those terms. I'm able to pepper in some personal information about the character. I'm trying to find ways of expressing that she's asexual. So having her be very uninterested in the romantic sexual lives of the characters in the heroic story, but more interested in this other romance, this other love of this character's life that she can understand, or she finds way more connection to. So it's the beginnings of the seeds of that characterization for that person too. But that's like one of a few different myths that I've built into the world. Of the world used to be way more magical than it was. And that's often the theme of many mythologies, is that, we live in a mundane place, but back in the day, there were gods and monsters and supernatural creatures, and that's why you explain things.
Right, exactly. And again, like you've been talking about, what you're talking about basically there is foreshadowing, essentially,
Yeah.
and characterization, which is fantastic. So in your TTRPGs, for example, this is a great way to hook your players. If you have something that you want to bring in Act 3, you make sure you mention it in Act 1.
Yes.
This is often called Chekhov's gun. In my notes, I've called it Chekhov's MacGuffin, because it's rarely a gun in fantasy worlds. Even in Flintlock fantasy, it's rarely a magical pistol, sadly. I want to see a magical ancient Greek pistol, but I haven't seen one yet, and that disappoints me. So yeah, Chekhov's MacGuffin is a great way to use myths and legends. And again, to sort of promise these things, promise what's coming to the story, and make your characters in the know. They'll clock onto it, probably, and that doesn't matter, because that's part of the fun of the storytelling, is knowing that this may or may not be important later. You can also use a couple of them so they don't know which one it's going to be. And then you bring one back later and they will clock it, and they will feel smart, and you will have made them enjoy the game just a little bit more, because they'll feel really smart. Could do exactly the same thing with readers.
Or it'll make you seem really smart if after the fact they catch, oh, that's what you did. Oh my gosh.
The power of planning here. So yeah, in terms of delivery of these, how can you use these in your world? I mean, you mentioned bards, which is the
a tale in a tavern, a song in a tavern. I imagine you could build it into your players. You could either during the game say, okay, you're from this location, you guys are in a, for lack of a better example, you're in the Grand Canyon right now, the fantasy Grand Canyon, and you're from this region, so and so. You know that this is what the mythology of this place is, and you can feed it in a story, but a story from the perspective of a character. You can sort of hold their hand a little bit and give them flavor for their own backstory that they might not have come up with unless you were handing them a hook
Right.
for their character to have, so you could have them deliver the information. You could, if you're in more collaborative mood, you could present a natural formation, or you could present a culture and say, hey guys, who knows about this? What's the story here? And you might be able to get some really neat perspectives from your players, not just something that you might have already built into the world.
Yeah.
You might discover something really, really cool. Half of the joy of DMing is discovering something your player said offhandedly, and you're like, oh, that's going in my book.
That's a seed. I'm using that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't know. They're just like, I saw a video recently of dogs helping to reforest a burned area by just putting a backpack, and they drop seeds everywhere. It's kind of your players sometimes. They don't realize what they're doing, but they are occasionally setting a ton of seeds out for you to pluck up.
Forces of chaotic fertility. That's how I like to think of players. They're very imaginative, but they've got no idea what they're doing.
Or the implications.
Right, exactly. Another way that you can bring this in, you mentioned song and story, but another way that you can bring this in is the other arts. So
Sure,
sculpture
yeah.
and tapestry and painting and this kind of stuff. It's one of the elements that people always forget about world building. Even from the earliest prehistoric cultures, we find art, we find sculpture, we find pots which have been not just made, but engraved carefully for aesthetic value. Aesthetic value has been important for all sapient species, as far as we can tell, for a very long time. And somehow when we start building our worlds, we're like, it doesn't matter what it looks like. Nobody pays for art. Everything. I don't know why this happens to us.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, we're so busy thinking about the political system of our world, which, like, the average person, like Joe Blogs on the street, is like, oh, whatever, the politics isn't really relevant to me. And yet we forget about things like the everyday art, the everyday style of things. And myths and legends is a great way to work that in, to have a statue of a great hero, to have a statue of a deity, to have a statue that commemorates a particular moment in a story. But yeah, sorry, you were saying.
Well, I was going to say, think about how many cultures have monuments that still exist, and they can be abstract or they can be incredibly literal. You just have, like, literally a person, a hero of that culture or a god of that culture, typified by a elaborate marble statue, and any sort of things. Like, you can develop your culture's aesthetics based on the kinds of monuments that they do. What if they carve into cliff sides and it's facing out to the ocean? There's a reason why no one actually seems to see those things, because they're not for people. They're for some other purpose, some larger purpose of maybe like a guardian or something like that. You can think outside of just aesthetics for the sake of the people of the culture. There might be other reasons why they're building things. You look at those very large engravings, and I believe it's in a South American country, where it's artwork into the hillside, and you can't see it unless you're from a plane.
Right. They have these in they have these in the UK as well. These short courses cut into the
clearly intending for something above us to see this. This is not about the people on the ground seeing this. So you can always build in situations where they're only seeing it from a very small perspective, and then if they ever get high enough, or they ever learn the fly spell, they suddenly see the bigger picture of what this is supposed to be.
Yes.
You can have nice reveals in that way if they're only seeing that small, like, cutout of what's going on in the mural or some sort of
right, exactly. And then you're like, suddenly NASCAR lines. Boom.
Yeah.
We do have to jump to questions, but I would very quickly like to just touch on, how do you work myths and legends into settings outside the standard fantasy genre? Because of course, having a bard and a tavern, it's like myth and legend 101. It's a great place to start. It's a really, really good way to leverage them. How do you do that in, like, urban fantasy or sci-fi or science fantasy?
Okay. I have a sci-fi-ish story that I worked on for a while. It's sort of on the back burner, but it involves people getting and it's only a couple hundred years of history, people getting superpowers. And it involved like a meteor hitting several places in the earth, several meteors, and it's become very um what's the word for it? It's just a very primal imagery of this is the origin of our people. And so that image of something falling from the sky has become very aesthetically important to those cultures, even though they're spread all over the world, they all sort of consider themselves one group. And so I had that. It sort of became a mythological. It became mythological in importance because it is the origin of their people, and so that's sort of I played a little bit into that with it. What ostensibly was like a sci-fi superhero story. I have someone making a mural out of bottle caps that they collected. So there's like, oh man, they're really excited that the root beer has a red cap so that they can put that up in like the fire of the meteor that they're building. So it's that feels a little bit like playing classical mythology or classical origin stories and planting it into a more modern setting. But do you have any thoughts about doing like more science fiction-y stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways you can do it. The one that I think is most prevalent is urban legends.
Oh
Um,
yeah, there you go.
so like alligators in the sewers, haunted videotapes, like ghost stories, these kinds of things. This is what we see in the modern world as like modern myths and legends. People aren't talking about ghost stories from the 15th century, they're talking about ghost stories from now.
Yeah.
And The Ring is what comes to mind, the one with the haunted TV. I'm really not a horror
The
person
haunted
at all.
videotape.
Right, exactly. I'm not a horror person at all, so forgive me having no horror references because I am a massive wimp. I went on a family ghost tour and I got so scared that I couldn't sleep that night. Horror is not my genre. But yeah, so that's really one way is urban legends, stories told in bars that nobody should listen to, this kind of stuff.
Well, something that just occurred to me, Neil Gaiman's American Gods. The modern gods,
yeah.
I think, is a really interesting idea. You play with perhaps the idea of belief in a concept can evolve. That we used to fear fire, there were gods of fire. We now fear lack of privacy. Now there's some supernatural implication to that being a more driving force.
Hello, FBI man. Hello. How you feeling? But yeah, for example.
So if you had a more science fiction setting, you could certainly have, especially depending on how far you're going, how distant of a future are you dealing with? You could certainly think back on, okay, what's stuff going on now in terms of modern technology or modern cultural movements, and what could be turned into the myths that those people now believe in. Take a historical event and then just go like outside the scope of what the mundane thing that happened, and just make it feel more otherworldly or make it feel more grand than it might have been.
Yeah. There's one more thing that I can think of right now, just off the cuff, which is if you're sci-fi enough, you get the mythologies of alien species, and then we're right back where we were at the beginning, talking about how the culture and the mythos of a society tells you so much about that society, and the way that they view such and such tells you a lot about them.
Star Trek did this pretty thoroughly.
Yeah.
There's a lot of mythology being pulled in with different cultures of like Klingon warriors definitely have a different origin story or a different mythology than say the Vulcans do. There's lots of that.
Babylon 5 absolutely nailed this, for example. And as did with Stargate. Stargate is the other one that absolutely used.
Well, that's a fun one. That's a fun one that takes our understanding of mythology and then supplants it in a different setting, and in fact gives our origin stories a different origin story, which I always really dug about that about Stargate.
Mythology that is true, but not how you think it is.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
like, well, they were kind of aliens.
Everyone was aliens in that show. All the aliens.
Yeah.
All right. I am being nudged by my producer to get some questions asked.
I'm excited.
So let's see what you have been asking us. This is not the right channel. This is the right channel. All right, here we go. Ruby Moon asks, how thin is the difference between religion's cosmology, I think that's supposed to be, and mythologies, if there is one?
I feel like cosmology is an element of mythology, but that could just be, like I said, semantics. That cosmology is I guess maybe the macro explanations, but it all falls under, at least. So it turns out that my definitions of mythology tend to be how the natural order came about. But cosmology is that very wide view of that. I wish, I really need to make a point to go find this. I found a fantasy RPG world building suggestion of the way that they do calendars and time in their world, that each month is represented by a constellation that is very prominent in the sky at that time period. And so there's a myth surrounding, and we have myths surrounding our constellations. And then each of the months are called watches, and it's that mythological person or that mythological creature is then considered sort of the guardian of that lunar cycle. And so I thought that was really, really neat, but that ties I don't know if there was really an explanation for why the stars existed, which would be more the cosmology stuff, but cosmonology, I don't remember. one is makeup, one is or that's cosmetology. My brain is not together today. But I really like this idea of building in understanding that there are constellations, having that similar view of the world, like, oh, that's kind of shaped like that, or we're just going to justify it kind of looks like that. And then clearly having a mythological story about that figure, but then incorporating that into how the celestial mechanics of the world work. I think the Game of Thrones doesn't really go into it, the Song of Ice and Fire series, but I mean, you build a world in which the seasons are super messed up. That's going to have the reason that happened would have to be either incredibly magical, or there's just something with the way that world works from a physics standpoint.
Right. There's some
causes that.
Yeah, there's some sort of celestial body voodoo going on there with extra moons or another planet pulling it out of orbit or something.
And when you're dealing with I mean, obviously everything's interconnected. You deal with a large scale, you're going to end up in the smaller scale. But for simplicity's sake, we have a calendar in Countless Heroes that's 28 days, 12 months. That's it. It's like so much easier to just track like that. But you have to understand that the reason that it's imperfect in our world is because of orbits and the rotation of the Earth. And there's lots of little off-centered reasons for why we track time the way we do. And if you had something that was perfect, that means that all the other systems outside of it are going to be relatively symmetrical and even. And what does that say about the mythology of your world? What does that say about how people perceive how the universe was created? Well, it was created perfectly and symmetrically. What does that mean for the way people see the world around them? It's not random then. It's done very meticulously in particular, so that it's these perfect, you go into like spheres of like heavenly spheres at that. I was
going to say that's music of the spheres territory, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is like full on medieval cosmology. You know, there are planets, there are 6 planets, there are 6 notes. You know, that's how the medieval world worked.
Connecting the dots.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and we want to do that so intrinsically. We want to make patterns. We, as people, we want to find patterns and connective tissue that, yeah, it makes sense to go from that direction. But yeah, I would say cosmology is part of mythology, but just it's the looking outward at where your world is set.
Right, exactly. And I think mythologies can look at a whole bunch of other aspects, but cosmology is focused very much on where did the world come from? How do the major deity forces, whatever they are, how do they operate? And you can have mythologies within a religion, and you can have mythologies outside a religion. But cosmology generally only deals with religion.
Yes, the origin. It's our dragon mother myth is definitely cosmology.
Right, exactly.
How did the world even come to exist? Not just how does it work once you're on it.
Right, exactly. But you could argue that in the ancient Greek mythos, let's just take that because it's ubiquitous, everyone is familiar with it. You have the kind of Gaia as the earth mother, and this is how the earth began and all of this stuff. And there are some primordial deities and the Titans and more primordial deities. I can't remember what they are offhand. And then, so that would be cosmology. But then also you could argue that cosmology is the story of Semele and Zeus. Cosmology is the story of possibly even Hercules, because Hercules is half god. So is that cosmology or is that mythology? And that's where I see the line blurring, is when you get deities or deity-like things doing mythological stories or mythological actions, which are then remembered as mythology. So for me, that's where the overlap is. Let's move on to another question.
Yes.
Would you recommend to start with a creation myth when building a new world, or is it better to tailor one after you set basic laws and rules for your world?
I think there's no wrong answer to that. I think my book with the Land of Fallen Giants, I had my story. I have my interpersonal character story, and I'm building that around it. That I realized, oh, well, this makes it feel different and fresh. And this is a setting that my story could take place in a lot of different kinds of worlds. I've just chosen that this is a neat way to frame the world. And as I've gone on, what I intend to be the second arc of that story starts building in with that mythology, but it didn't have to at first. I've just sort of gone back and said, okay, this is actually this new world concept that I've got. And with Countless Heroes, we started with that little seed of the origin and branched out. I think it's worth trying both and seeing what feels more natural. And you might, even if you find you focus on one and you're good at one, you might find that one day you try it the other way and it works for you. I think it really just matters on where inspiration strikes.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that it's a good idea to have more than one creation myth or more than one interpretation of the creation myth. Now, that depends on how true your creation myth is within the paracosm that you're creating. So if you're creating, if you know this is how the world began, if you know the world was birthed by the giant world spider, then fine. Also, I'm so sorry for you because ugh. But if that is true, and there are giant world spiders wandering around outside of the setting of your world.
First of all, gross.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. But why do I come up with these examples? These are horrific examples. It could have been anything. World spiders. On the other hand, that would explain the many worlds theory.
It's a web.
Right.
Hey.
And many eggs.
Okay, now I'm already digging this. I'm grossed out and digging it.
Angela, you and I have to write this book.
Oh man.
So my point behind all of this, before I got distracted with my own horrific example, was that if this is true, then it's more likely that you will have various spin-offs of the same story as it passes through oral history, because there is more truth in it. And that is one way that you can do this. On the other hand, with our own world, of course, we have the Big Bang Theory, which is the most believed origin story, and that's the one I personally believe. But if you look at many, many cultures over many, many different times and in different places, you see absolutely billions of different ideas about how the world was formed. That's just our world. So if we're looking at our world for inspiration, you can imagine, I mean, I wouldn't create 15 because who has the time, right? But I might create 2 or 3 predominant ones. They may even have the odd similarity. And then within those predominant theories, I would have other permutations that different people believe. and again, this depends how important it is for you. That is how I would like to approach creation myths, because I feel like it's much more it's got much more verisimilitude than just this is how the world was built and everybody believes this.
Well, and that nuance gives you a lot of room to play.
Exactly, and it also keeps your players or your readers on their toes, because they never do know which is the real one, probably, until they have to. So it keeps the mystery as well as keeping this kind of verisimilitude, this authenticity in your world. And with regards to before or after basic laws and rules, it's up to you. You can use the one to inspire the other. You can use the other to inspire the first. It doesn't really matter. Whatever the hook is for your world, whatever you've got excited about in that world, whatever you're building it, follow that, because that's gonna lead you to the gold.
Well, and you can always work backwards if you're thinking about starting with metaphysical rules of, say, you start everything is the way our world works except this one thing is different.
Right.
Well, think about the cultural implications of that one thing being so different. Think about what sort of mythology, what sort of explanations people would have for why that does that thing. I don't have a good example right now. Sure. Fire is sentient. I don't know. And you build back from that, and you could probably pretty easily construct a few different origin myths from that one metaphysical rule being different than our own. So I think there are ways to kind of fluctuate back and forth. You can let them inform each other quite dramatically. So yeah, I'm all for thinking inside any of those boxes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, start with your premise, whatever that is, and work out. So don't get fussed about where you start. Just let the process flow. Because in my opinion, that's the best way to have a world that integrates well. Also, the minute you said fire is sentient, I was like, may all your bacon burn. Howl's Moving Castle. Right.
Oh, there's a diner in my town that has a little leek drawn on the side. It was like a bunch of little fruit with faces, and I swear the leek looks like Hell's Fire. I'm like, this is not a leek.
This is a fire demon. All right, we have one more question that I'm going to answer very quickly. Is it possible to have a small indication of this month's challenge? Well, spoiler alert, it's going to be about myths and legends. So it's a great idea right now to start thinking about the mythical characters in your world, start thinking about mythologies in your world, what kind of stories have been carried down as stories that are told to your children and told to their children, are passed through oral tradition, stories that are then maybe formalized or not in written prose, and how these integrate with your world, how these affect your world, and how the world has affected and formed them. So that is the best piece of advice I can give you in preparation for our community challenge. And Angela has given you so much good advice for that. So guys, I hope that you have enjoyed having her here. It has been an absolute blast talking to you. Thank you so much for joining.
I have very much enjoyed, to the point where I have more stuff I want to talk about now.
Yay! Well, we'll have to get you back. I've had so much fun chatting with you. You can find Angela, who is at Darling Gypsum on Twitter. You can find her at www.nerdsmith.org, and you can find her on Countless Heroes. That is twitch.tv/WeAreNerdsmith. Tune into Countless Heroes to see her playing an absolutely adorable barbarian with artistic leanings. Absolutely splendid.
My painting murder child. I love her so.
It really is a hilarious and wonderful campaign. I don't have a lot of free time to watch Twitch live campaigns, sadly, but every time I tune in, I find myself kind of giggling along with what's going on. It's always easy to jump in there because you're also engaging. So guys, I can't recommend it enough. It really is fun. And of course, if you are in the LA area, make sure that you go to WonderCon. That is March the 30th at the Hilton in Anaheim, California. That is kind of like the outskirts of Los Angeles, I think.
It's a couple hours south of LA, I think. But yeah, I'll be driving to Anaheim.
Good luck with that. Well, guys, if you are interested in attending that and meeting Angela in person, she is super interesting, as you have just found out. Demetrius is dropping the Facebook event in the chat now, where you can find out more about that, or you can tweet her at darling_gypsum on Twitter and find out more about that as well.
Yes, please.
And if you go take loads of pictures, because we can't be there. It's one of the reasons we sponsored it, because we were like, we want to be there and we can't be there, so we'll just sponsor it. So that's how that happened. this episode will be going up on YouTube. And if you are in the future and you are listening on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe for more world building content.
Click that bell.
Talking to you in the future. And it only remains that we should grab our hammer and go world build. Bye.